Wait a second, Carl. We've been here before. Interstate 72 is your first episode of Interstates. Remember?
Yes, I do remember. I remember quite clearly. Nobody deserves to watch that video, so that's why we're here now. In case you can't tell by now, Interstate 72 is my favorite interstate, and Illinois is my favorite state. I don't know why, but it's probably because I grew up in Decatur. If there are any creepy stalkers in the audience, just letting you know now, I don't live in Decatur anymore, so don't waste your time. Also, my name isn't actually Carl Sampson, so that'd be a dead lead too. Also, this doesn't count towards the episode count of Season 1. This is just me redoing Episode 1, so if this were a TV show, this episode would be considered non-canonical. But enough about stalking and TV shows, let's talk about Interstate 72! Again. Interstate 72 is a 179-mile-long east-to-west interstate running from Interstate 57 in Champaign, Illinois to the Avenue of the Saints in Hannibal, Missouri. I-72's east end is at County Fair Drive in Champaign, Illinois. From here it continues west for about a half mile where it has a cloverleaf exit with Interstate 57. From here 72 continues west to Seymour where it meets Illinois State Route 47. From here I-72 turns southwest where it exits with Illinois Route 10 before exiting in White Heath. From here 72 meets Illinois 105 and Bridge Street in Monticello. 72 then meets Illinois routes 48 and 32 in Cisco, where 72 turns even further southwest. It then turns due west outside of Decatur, where it meets Illinois State Route 48 again. A couple miles later, 72 meets a cloverleaf exit with US Route 51, where 51 turns west and becomes concurrent with 72. The two meet State Route 121 as they turn south. On the west side of Decatur, 72 and 51 have a spaghetti interchange with US Route 36, which ends in 51 going south to Pana and 72 and 36 gaining concurrency as they continue due west towards Springfield. 72 doesn't meet any state or U.S. routes between Springfield and Decatur, but it does exit in the towns of Niantic, Illiopolis, Buffalo, and Dawson. It then crosses the Sangamon River and has an exit for the Camp Butler National Cemetery. Entering Springfield, we reach I-72's original western terminus. However, from here, 72 turns south and becomes concurrent with I-55. 55, 72, and 36 have a cloverleaf exit with Illinois State Route 29 and then turn west again, where 55 breaks off to go south and 72 continues west towards Jacksonville. Leaving Springfield, 72 exits with Illinois State Route 4, before entering western Sangamon County, where the wind turbines lie. In between Springfield and Jacksonville, 72 has exits in New Berlin and Alexander, before turning southwest and exiting with Illinois State Route 104 in Jacksonville. It also meets Illinois Route 267 and US Route 67. 72 exits with Old US Route 36 in Winchester and Illinois Route 100 south of Bluffs. 72 crosses the Illinois River and then exits in Pittsfield, where US 54 meets its northern end and Illinois 107 its southern one. From here, 72 exits in New Salem and Barry. 72 then meets Illinois Route 96 in Hull, where I-72 meets its one and only spur, I-172, which spurs up to Quincy. 72 goes west to exit with Illinois Route 106 before crossing the Mississippi River into Hannibal, Missouri. Interstate 72 immediately exits with Missouri State Route 79 in downtown Hannibal, before meeting US Route 61, also known as the Avenue of the Saints, where 72 officially ends. I know, it doesn't make it that far into Missouri, does it? So, as for 72's history, the original route designated as I-72 was the segment connecting Decatur to Champaign. However, this was eventually extended to Springfield, and that's how the route stayed until the 1990s. In the 90s, a spur route was proposed that would go from Springfield to Quincy. However, this spur route, which was named I-172, was longer than the original route, so they just decided to extend 72 west instead. It's up in the air where I-72's future lies. There are plans on MoDOT's end to extend 72 from Hannibal to Cameron, Missouri, but government officials declared this a low-priority project, so it probably won't happen anytime soon. However, parts of US 36 in Missouri are at interstate standards, such as the route from Hannibal to US 24 and parts in Shelbina, Macon, and other small towns. A big potential factor in 72's expansion will be the Chicago-Kansas City Expressway, a route connecting Kansas City to Chicago, and a future video topic. However, even that hasn't deterred politicians. That's about all there is to say for 72, so I'll see you next time on Interstates, where we cover Interstate 43.
Here I am, back again with another Redux video. I plan to do the same idea with Interstate 57 later on. But anyways, Interstate 39 was constructed in 1986 and runs 306 miles from Wausau, Wisconsin to Bloomington, Normal, Illinois. In terms of history, there isn't much. It was originally planned to end at I-72 in Decatur, but that was shelved in favor of a southern terminus at 55 in Normal. However, 39's earliest routes can be traced back to the invention of the system, when Illinois requested a route going from South Beloit to Salem, where it would likely end at I-57. Interstate 39 begins at a trumpet interchange with I-55 in Bloomington. From the start, it is concurrent with US Route 51. A few miles further in Kappa, 39 meets Illinois State Route 251, which was the original Route 51 before 39 was constructed. Further north in El Paso, 39 meets US 24. In Woodford, 39 meets Illinois State Route 116. In case you haven't noticed, 39 mostly travels through farmland and small towns for about its first 100 miles. But anyways, in Winona, I-39 meets Illinois Route 17. A few miles later, 39 meets Illinois 18. In Oglesby, 39 meets Illinois 251 again, as well as Illinois 71, which eventually connects back to I-180 in Hennepin. From here, 39 crosses the Illinois River and exits with US 6 on the other side in LaSalle, Peru. Afterwards, 39 meets Interstate 80. In Troy Grove, 39 meets US 52 and then meets US 34 in Mendota. It also meets US 30 in the literal middle of nowhere. In Rochelle, I-39 meets not only Illinois Route 38, but also Interstate 88 and the Chicago-Kansas City Expressway with it. I-39 meets Illinois routes 64 and 72 before entering Rockford. In Rockford, 39 and 51, which has been concurrent with 39 this entire time, starts a 2-mile concurrency with US 20. However, they lose the concurrency but then gain a concurrency with Interstate 90. The three have a few more exits before meeting Illinois 75 and South Beloit, where US 51 exits the concurrency. From here, I-39 and I-90 continue into the state of Wisconsin. Immediately after crossing the border, 39 and 90 meet Interstate 43 in Beloit. The two also meet State Route 11, State Route 26, and US 14 in Janesville. Later on, they cross the Rock River and then exit with State Route 59 in Newville. They also begin concurrency with US 51 again north of Edgerton. That being said, they lose concurrency with 51 again just east of Stoughton. In Madison, 39 and 90 meet US routes 12 and 18. A few miles north, 39 and 90 pick up a third interstate, I-94. The three continue north and meet US 151, US 51, and Wisconsin Route 19 on the north side of Madison. South of Portage, the three cross the Wisconsin River. In Portage, 39 breaks off from 90 and 94. Now on the only segment of I-39 that isn't concurrent with another route, 39 meets State Routes 33 and 16 before becoming concurrent with US 51 again on the north side of Portage. In Endeavor, 39 meets Wisconsin Route 23. It also meets State Route 82 outside of Oxford. 39 also meets Route 21 in Coloma and Route 73 in Plainfield. In Stevens Point, 39 exits Route 54, becomes concurrent with US 10, meets Route 66, loses concurrency with US 10, and then crosses Lake Dubay. In Mossany, 39 meets State Routes 34 and 153. It then meets its end at an interchange with State Route 29 south of Wausau. While this is the official end of I-39, US 51 continues north at interstate standards up until Merrill, and is an expressway all the way up to US 8 at Heifer Junction, so who knows, maybe 39 will be extended north someday? Anyways, thanks for watching, and keep an eye out for our next episode of Interstates, the last of Season 1.
Hello there, I'm back with the third episode of Interstates. Today I'm going to be covering Interstate 57, which starts in Chicago and goes to Sikeston, Missouri. The oldest segment of I-57 was roughly a 6-mile-long strip constructed in Kankakee back in 1959. There's not much else in the way of history for this route, that's kinda it, so let's talk about the route itself. Interstate 57 runs 386 miles between Illinois and Missouri, and like Interstate 72, 57 is primarily an Illinois interstate, only crossing into Missouri for a couple of miles. I-57 starts in downtown Chicago at an exit with I-94 and I-90, which you can take northwest to get to I-39. Immediately after going west, it interchanges with Illinois Route 1. From there it turns south and immediately crosses the Little Calumet River, and approaches an exit with I-294, US Route 6, and I-80. Further south, in Madison, I-57 intersects the Lincoln Highway, also known as US Route 30, and after that, I-57 leaves the Chicago area, still continuing south towards the Kankakee area. After roughly 20 miles, I-57 has an exit in Manteno, followed by one for Bourbonnais and Bradley. Afterward, there is an interchange for Kankakee and an exit for US Route 52. Continuing south from Kankakee, I-57 has an exit with US Route 24 in Gilman. Down the road, it intersects 136 in Rantoul before entering the Champaign-Urbana area. In Champaign, since I-57 never actually goes through Urbana, there is a cloverleaf exit with Interstate 74, which can either take you to Danville or Bloomington, depending on your direction. Following the exit with 74, there is an exit with I-72 immediately after, which will either take you to downtown Champaign, the end of 72, or to Decatur and eventually Springfield. After about another 30 miles or so, I-57 has an exit with US Route 36 in Tuscola, which will either take you to Decatur or will take you to Indianapolis. Continuing even further southward, I-57 interchanges with Illinois Route 16 and barely misses Route 121 before intersecting US 45 on the south side of Mattoon.
I-57 continues even further south, where eventually it has an exit with I-70, and the two become concurrent as they circle around Effingham. The two intersect US Route 40 and US Route 45 in Effingham before I-70 breaks off for St. Louis and I-57 continues southward to Mount Vernon. But before I-57 reaches Mount Vernon, it has an exit with US Route 50 in Salem, and you can tell exactly where I-39 would have ended if it had been 100% completed. Now we have Mount Vernon, where I-57 has an exit with I-64, which can take you to St. Louis, and the two become concurrent as they go through Mount Vernon. On the south side of Vernon, 64 breaks off and heads for Louisville. Yes, Louisville, Kentucky. I-57 keeps going south where it has exits for Benton, West Frankfort, there is no East Frankfort, and Marion. South of Marion, 57 interchanges with its last interstate in Illinois, where it has a one-way exit for I-24, which will take you to Paducah, Kentucky. 57 goes south, where it has an exit with US Route 51, and the two are concurrent until Cairo, which is also the last Illinois exit. 57 crosses the Mississippi River, where it crosses into Missouri. From there, it has an exit with US Route 62 in Charleston. Finally, I-57 comes to a close in Sikeston, Missouri, where it exits with I-55 and continues westward as US Route 60. It is important to note that there have been talks of extending 57 even further into Missouri and eventually into Arkansas, but nothing has been finalized yet. And that about does it for this episode of Interstates. I'll see you next time when I cover... Alright, never mind, it's gonna be a while. So, change of plans. We aren't doing Interstate 64. Per fan request, we'll be doing Interstate 80 this episode. We'll do 64 next time. So let's pretend this is a good transition and get started. Interstate 80, usually abbreviated to I-80 or even 80, is an east-to-west cross-country interstate that runs 2,900 miles from San Francisco, California to Teaneck, New Jersey. The interstate came to be in 1956 and work continued until its completion in 1986. The route runs through the states of New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, Nebraska, Wyoming, Utah, Nevada, and California. I-80 starts, or ends depending on your direction, in San Francisco at an exit with US Route 101. It then immediately crosses the San Francisco Bay into Oakland, where it junctions two of its own spur routes, 580 and I-880. It then moves northwest through several suburbs and smaller routes, eventually junctioning Interstate 780 and I-680. From there it leaves the San Francisco area, exiting with Interstate 505 shortly after. 80 bypasses the Sacramento metro area, instead following a route around the city where it junctions Interstate 5 north of Sacramento. From there it continues northwest through some of Sacramento's suburbs until entering a more mountainous and forested part of California. I-80 continues through several smaller towns in eastern California before exiting the state into Nevada. I-80 turns due north toward Verdi. Immediately after entering Verdi, though, 80 turns east and enters the Reno area. I-80 junctions Nevada Route and Beltway 659. From there, 80 continues into downtown Reno, exiting with I-580, a spur for Carson City, before junctioning Route 659 again in West Reno. I-80 continues northwest towards Fernley, where it exits with Alt Route 95 and Alt Route 50. 80 continues through smaller Nevadan cities such as Lovelock, Imlay, and Mill City. 80 enters the town of Winnemucca. From here, 80 turns southwest for about 40 miles before entering the town of Battle Mountain. I-80 continues to curve and weave its way through central Nevada, entering and exiting the towns of Carlin, Elko, and Wells. I-80 then has an exit in the non-existent town of Oasis before having its last exit in West Windover. It then exits the state of Nevada into the state of Utah, immediately with an exit for Windover. Interstate 80 continues due east for about 44 miles before turning northwest and then southwest. It curves its way around Great Salt Lake before entering Salt Lake City. In downtown Salt Lake City, 80 has an exit with an I-15 spur route, Interstate 215. It then begins a north-south concurrency for Interstate 15 for about 3 miles, before exiting due east towards Summit Park. After going through Summit Park and Silver Summit, 80 curves north towards I-84, before going northwest towards Wyoming. I-80 has 2 more exits before entering the state of Wyoming. Shortly after entering the Equality State, 80 meets State Route 89 in Evanston. 80 remains mostly straightforward throughout west and central Wyoming, going through the major cities of Green River, Rock Springs, Rollins, and Laramie, all of which maintain a population under 55,000 by the way. I-80 meets Interstate 25 in the city of Cheyenne, Wyoming. It also has a non-interstate standard spur route. You'll see this a lot. 80 struggles to make good spur routes. From here, I-80 continues due east until exiting Wyoming and the western United States. Welcome to the Midwest, where we make corn! Interstate 80 has officially entered the midwestern state of Nebraska, and will continue east for a little while before entering the town of Sidney.
This is a segment of 80 that is never any more than 15 miles north of the Colorado border at any time. I-80 then junctions with Interstate 76. The odd thing about this junction is that there is no nearby town, it just kind of happens in the middle of nowhere. At this point, I-80 is concurrent with the South Platte River through the towns of Ogalla, Paxton, and Sutherland. In the rather large town, at least rather large for central Nebraska anyway, of North Platte, I-80 officially stops paralleling the South Platte River, only for it to follow the regular Platte River. I-80 follows the Platte River through the towns of Gothenburg, Cozad, Lexington, and Kearney. Near the town of Grand Island, I-80 stops following the Platte River and just moves due east toward Omaha. On its way to Omaha, I-80 nearly misses the town of York. It also misses the lovely named town of Beaver Crossing. We're almost to Omaha, but I can ignore the elephant in the room no longer. The city of Pleasant Dale. But more importantly, 80 goes to the city of Lincoln, Nebraska. In Lincoln, I-80 has one spur, I-180, which is arguably the only good Interstate 180 out of all of them. Outside of Lincoln, 80 curves northwest where it meets our old friend the Platte River, before entering Omaha. Interstate 680, a spur of 80, goes around and outside Omaha. However, 80 itself just goes straight through the town, crossing the Missouri River into Council Bluffs, Iowa. In Council Bluffs, 80 maintains a nearly 3-mile concurrency with Interstate 29. Exiting Council Bluffs, I-80 curves northwest where it junctions I-880 and turns due east. 80 exits with US 59 in Abaca, Iowa, then exits with US Route 71 and starts a concurrency with US 6 outside of Atlantic. In the suburb of DeSoto, I-80 exits with US 169 before entering West Des Moines. In West Des Moines, I-80 has an interchange with I-35 and I-235. I-80 turns north and then east and starts its 15-mile-long concurrency with I-35 around the northern parts of Des Moines. Leaving Des Moines, I-80 loses its concurrency with US 6 in Newton, and then continues east towards Grinnell. 80 moves due east towards Iowa City, where it spurs with I-380, an interstate that moves north towards Cedar Rapids and ends in Waterloo. Outside of the Quad Cities area, I-280 begins its existence, serving as a useful bypass for non-local drivers. Shortly afterward, 80 exits with the Avenue of the Saints, a route that takes St. Louis to St. Paul, also known as US Route 61. After that, 80 exits with Interstate 74 and then curves around the north sides of the Quad Cities before turning south and crossing the Mississippi River into the state of Illinois. After crossing into Illinois, I-80 then has an exit with I-88 before crossing the Rock River, exiting again with Interstate 74 and then turning due east towards Chicago. In northwestern Illinois, 80 goes to the towns of Geneseo, Atkinson, Onawan, and Langley before junctioning US Route 34 and Illinois State Route 26 in Princeton. Outside of Princeton, Interstate 80 then conjures up its third I-180, this time dubbed the useless highway that goes literally nowhere. Illinois I-180 spurs south into Hennepin. There's a lot of history behind this route, but I'm not going to delve into it here. I-80 then junctions Illinois Route 251 and 351 in LaSalle, Peru before exiting with Interstate 39, which can either take you to Rockford or Bloomington. At this point, Interstate 80 parallels US Route 6 and the Illinois River, where all three junction Illinois Route 71. By this point, we've started hitting the outer Chicago suburbs. Interstate 80 goes through about 15 Chicago suburbs, give or take. I'm not going to name them all here. However, 80 meets I-55 in Channahon, 355 in New Lenox, Interstate 57 in Country Club Hills, and begins a concurrency with I-294 in Hazel Crest. 80 continues its concurrency up until it meets I-94 in Thornton. At this point, 80 begins a concurrency with 94, and the two continue into Munster, Indiana. Welcome to Indiana, prepare to be told. I-80 and I-294 meet both I-65 and I-90 in Lake Station. At this point, the two longest interstates, I-80 and I-90, in the United States have begun a concurrency. Everyone take cover, this is going to be big. The two meet US Route 35 in LaPorte and US 31 in South Bend, Notre Dame. The pair has a couple of exits in Elkhart and Bristol, before getting dangerously close to the Michigan border. They then proceed to have an abomination of an interchange with Interstate 69 before entering Ohio and exiting the Midwestern United States. Welcome to Ohio! Welcome to Pennsylvania! In all seriousness, the Ohio Turnpike is one of the biggest vessels in northern Ohio, and there's no way I couldn't talk about it. The 80-90 duo becomes the Ohio Turnpike, which is consistent across pretty much the entire state. The Turnpike has an exit with US 127 just north of West Unity. It then proceeds to have tolled exits in Delta and Swanton before entering the outskirts of Toledo. In the Toledo area, the Ohio Turnpike has exits with I-475, US 20, I-75, and I-280. Continuing east, the Turnpike has an exit with US 6 outside of Fremont. It then has a tolled exit with Ohio State Route 4 down the road. North of Norwalk, US 250 says hello, and then State Route 61 almost does the same. Welcome to Amherst. Interstate 90 has officially left the Turnpike, and 80 is alone again naturally. Shortly afterward, I-480 spurs off into downtown Cleveland from North Bridgeville. After this, 80 has an exit with Interstate 71. few miles after the I-71 exit, 80 meets up with Interstate 77. It then has an exit with State Route 8, which works as an access route to Interstate 271. Finally, 80 meets 480 again on the western side of Cleveland. I-80 has a few more exits before curving southeast and swapping roads with Interstate 76. And no, it's not the same 76 from Nebraska. Having officially exited the Ohio Turnpike, 80 kisses tolls goodbye and crosses the Meander Creek Reservoir. It then has an exit with Ohio Route 46 and Mineral Ridge before swapping roads with I-680. Interstate 80 then has exits with Ohio Route 7, 11, and 711. It then immediately enters Pennsylvania and the town of Wheatland. Afterward, 80 has an exit with spur route Interstate 376 in West Middlesex. By this point, 80 has started to enter the Appalachian Mountains area. Between Mercer and Grove City, 80 has an interchange with Interstate 79. It then works its way across eastern Pennsylvania, exiting in the cities of Barkeyville, Clintonville, Emlenton, Corsica, and Brookville. 80 then has an exit with US 219 in Du Bois. Working its way deeper into the Appalachians, 80 has exits with smaller towns such as Plimptonville, Schuylertown, Snowshoe, and Millersburg. Outside of Zion, 80 serves as the northern terminus for Interstate 99 before turning northeast for Mackeyville, where it has an exit with US 220 and State Route 64. After Mackeyville, 80 passes through the towns of Loganton, Old Furnace, and New Columbia. Outside of New Columbia, 80 exits with US 15, crosses the West Branch Susquehanna River, and then spurs it with its fourth and final Interstate 180. 80 then has exits in Mousdale, Buckhorn, Light Street, and Lime Ridge, where it crosses the Susquehanna River. I apologize, I guarantee you I am somehow butchering that name. Shortly thereafter, 80 has a cloverleaf interchange with Interstate 81 outside of St. John's. Down the road, 80 exits with Interstate 476, which can either take you to Scranton or Allentown. Continuing even further down the road, 80 spurs up to Dixon City with Interstate 380. Finally, 80 has a few exits in Stroudsburg before crossing the Delaware River into its final state, New Jersey. Starting in New Jersey, 80 turns south and parallels the Delaware River for a few miles before turning east again outside of East Portland. 80 has an exit in Hope, and with that we have officially left the Appalachian Mountains. I-80 has an exit with US Route 206 in Stanhope, and then another exit with the same route in Netcong. Around this area, 80 exits multiple times at US 46 before exiting for Mount Arlington. In Parsippany, Troy Hills, 80 exits with Interstate 287. Following that, Interstate 280 spurs off for Newark. 80 then exits with New Jersey State Route 23 in North Caldwell. It also exits with State Route 19 in Patterson, and then exits in Lottie with Route 17. Finally, Interstate 80 ends its nearly 3,000-mile journey in Teaneck, New Jersey at an interchange with Interstate 95, just a mere 5 miles from downtown New York City. Whew, that was a long one, likely the longest this season. Assuming I still have a voice, I'll see you next episode of Interstate 64. For real this time. Starting in Wentzville, Missouri at an interchange with Interstate 70, I-64 runs 954 miles between 6 states. Welcome to WC Geography, and I'm back today with the 5th episode of Interstates, I-64. Continuing south from 70, I-64 continues through southern St. Louis, concurrent with US 61 and US 40 for most of the way. In Lake St. Louis, 64 exits with Missouri Route 364, which is a non-interstate spur into St. Charles and Maryland Heights. 64 meets Missouri Route 94 in Weldon Spring, and then curves south and crosses the Missouri River, entering Chesterfield. In Chesterfield, I-64 meets Missouri Route 340 and Missouri Route 141. Down the road in Westwood, I-64 meets Interstate 270, a downtown St. Louis bypass that spurs into Illinois. It then meets US Route 67 in Frontenac, where it loses concurrency with US 61. I-64 meets Interstate 170 in Clayton, where 170 ends and 64 continues to downtown St. Louis. In downtown STL, 64 meets bigger roads such as Big Bend Boulevard and Kings Highway Boulevard, before serving as the eastern end of Interstate 44 and beginning concurrency with Interstate 55. 64 and 55 cross the Poplar Street Bridge over the Mississippi River into East St. Louis, Illinois. In Illinois, the 64-55 duo meets Illinois Route 3 and Illinois Route 15, before curving north and having a spaghetti interchange with Interstate 70. In this mess of an interchange, I-64 exits 55 and continues east towards Mount Vernon. I-64 meets the routes of Illinois 111, Interstate 255, Illinois 157, and Illinois 159 in East St. Louis. Outside of O'Fallon, 64 meets Illinois State Route 158 and US Route 50. South of Lebanon, 64 also meets Illinois Route 4. Interstate 64 continues through southern central Illinois, meeting routes in the cities of New Baden, Oakawville, and Nashville. In Richview, 64 meets US 51 before meeting Interstate 57 in Mount Vernon. In Mount Vernon, 64 turns south for a bit, becoming concurrent with I-57. Remember me mentioning Illinois State Route 15 a minute ago? Well, 64 and 57 meet it again in Mount Vernon. The two also meet Route 148 before losing concurrency with each other. Leaving Mount Vernon, 64 exits with Illinois Routes 37 and 142. Down the road, Interstate 64 meets Illinois Route 242 in the literal middle of nowhere, and then meets US Route 45 south of Fairfield. Finally, 64 meets Illinois Route 1 in Grayville, where it crosses the Wabash River into Indiana. I-64 really doesn't meet any major routes in Indiana for a couple of miles. Its first major route is US 41 in Hobstadt. A few miles down the road, I-64 meets the incomplete Interstate 69 north of Evansville. I-64 meets several smaller routes in the towns of Linville, Selvin, and Dale. In Dale, 64 meets US 231, which continues south to Santa Claus. Down the road, 64 exits with Indiana State Route 162 south of Ferdinand. From here, 64 exits with some smaller state routes, but doesn't meet any major routes until Corydon. In Corydon, which was the Indiana state capital a long time ago, 64 meets both State Roads 337 and 135. A little bit after that, I-64 meets State Road 62, and confusingly meets State Road 64 in Duncan. It also meets US Route 150. It then meets Interstate 265 in New Albany before turning southeast and crossing the Ohio River into Louisville, Kentucky. Once in Louisville, 64 spurs off with Interstate 264 and then follows the Ohio River coastline for a mile or so. Also in Louisville, I-64 meets the routes of US Route 31 West, US Route 60, US Route 42, Interstate 65, Interstate 71, and Kentucky State Road 1020. Outside of downtown, 64 meets 264 again, and then meets 265 again. From here, 64 leaves Louisville and goes through the small towns of Simpsonville, Shelbyville, and Bridgeport. Down the road in Frankfort, I-64 meets US Route 127 and US 60 again. In Midway, 64 meets US 62 and US 421. In Lexington, I-64 begins a concurrency with Interstate 75. The two meet US 68 before 64 exits 75 on the east side of Lexington. In Winchester, 64 meets the Burt T. Combs Mountain Parkway. Up the road, in Mount Sterling, I-64 meets US 60 again and also meets US 460, as well as Kentucky State Route 11. 64 meets State Road 36 and US 60 again in Owingsville. Now at this point, 64 is almost in the Appalachian Mountains, so towns are becoming more and more spread out as we go. A long ways away from Owingsville, 64 meets Kentucky Route 32 in Moorhead. Even further down the road, I-64 meets Kentucky Route 2 in Olive Hill. After that, it meets US 60 again in Counts Crossroads. It then meets State Routes 1 and 7 in Grayson. After that, 64 meets US 60 for the final time in Kentucky in Colleton. Finally, I-64 meets US 23 in England Hill, where it crosses the Big Sandy River into West Virginia. Now in Canova, West Virginia, I-64 exits with US 52 before entering Soreto and eventually Huntington. In Huntington, 64 meets West Virginia State Routes 10 and 527. 64 then meets US 60 before exiting Huntington. 64 then passes through the cities of Barbersville, Ona, Milton, Culloden, Hurricane, Tees Valley, and Scary. Outside of Nitro, 64 crosses the Kanawha River. It then has exits in the suburbs of Cross Lanes, Institute, and Dunbar. In South Charleston, which is strangely north of Charleston, 64 crosses the Kanawha River again. Here it has exits with US Route 60 and 119 before crossing the Kanawha River for a third time into Charleston. In Charleston, 64 meets Interstate 77 and 79, acting as the southern end of 79 and turning south to become concurrent with 77. 64 and 77 parallel the Kanawha River through the towns of Marmot, Chesapeake, and Cheyenne, where the two have an exit with US 60. 77 and 64 turn south from here, where they continue into the rough terrain of the Central Appalachian Mountains. 64-77 goes through the extremely tiny towns of Dry Branch, Standard, Mahan, Mossy, Long Branch, and Pax. In Prosperity, 77-64 has an exit with US 19, and the two proceed to have several smaller exits in the city of Beckley. On the south side of Beckley, 64 loses its concurrency with 77, and 64 continues east towards Glen Morgan. Down the road, 64 has exits with Crow, Bragg, Sandstone, and Green Sulphur Springs, as well as Dawson and Sam Black Church, where 64 meets its longtime friend US 60. In Alta, 64 exits with State Route 12. I-64 then has an interchange with US 219 in Lewisburg. In White Sulphur Springs, 64 has a one-lane exit with US 60. 60 begins a concurrency with 64, and from here, Interstate 64 crosses into its sixth and final state, Virginia. A couple miles into Virginia, 64 loses its concurrency with 60, and then begins a concurrency with US Route 220 and US 60 again in Covington. 64-6220 has exits in Lowmore, Selma, and Clifton Forge, where 220 leaves the concurrency. From here, 64 and 60 have exits in Nicelytown, Longdale Furnace, and Kerrs Creek, which is where 60 leaves the concurrency. In East Lexington, which is confusingly north of Lexington, I-64 exits with US 11, and from there turns north and begins a concurrency with I-81. On 81-64, there is another exit with US Route 11. 81-64 passes through but doesn't necessarily exit in the towns of Timber Ridge, Decatur, Fairfield, Raffine, Spotswood, Greenville, and Mint Spring. In Staunton, the duo exits with Virginia State Routes 262, and then 64 exits onto its own road again. In Waynesboro, 64 exits with US Route 340 and 250, which begins to parallel I-64. In Yancey Mills, 64 exits with the US 250 again, but then becomes a lonely road until Charlottesville. In Charlottesville, 64 has an interchange with US 19, and then exits with 250 again. In Zion Crossroads, 64 exits with US 15. Down the road in, well, the middle of nowhere, 64 exits with Virginia State Route 208. After this, 64 turns southeast and has an exit with US Route 522 in Gum Spring. 64 then has an exit in Oilville. I-64 continues southeast where it meets Virginia State Route 288 in Short Pump. It then proceeds to have an exit with Interstate 295. In Henrico, 64 has 4 exits, 2 of which are for US 250. In Dumbarton, 64 exits with US Route 33. After this, 64 has a spaghetti interchange with I-195 and I-95, which ends in 64 and 95 becoming concurrent. Now in Richmond, 64 exits with US Route 301 before losing I-95 and exiting with US Route 360. Outside of Richmond, 64 exits once again with I-295 and parallels US 60 once again. 64 has officially left the Appalachian Mountains and has exits in Bottoms Bridge, Browns Corner, Carp's Corner, and Slaterville. From here, Interstate 64 continues southeast, where it exits with Virginia Route 199 in Williamsburg. Also in Williamsburg are roads that will take you to colonial Jamestown and Yorktown, where you will find many historic sites and museums. Back on 64 again, there is an exit with US 60 in Grove and an exit for Grafton, before entering Newport News. In Newport News, 64 has an exit with US Route 17 and US 258, as well as an exit with US 60. It also has an exit with its own spur route, I-664. After crossing the James River into Norfolk, 64 has its final exit with US 60 and then has an exit with US 460, as well as Interstate 564. 64 then works its way around the outside of Norfolk, exiting with US Routes 13 and 58 as well as its own spur route, Interstate 264. Quick note about 264, it actually works as the southern terminus for US 60 in Virginia Beach. Back on 64, it has a few more exits in Norfolk before it enters Chesapeake. Now in Chesapeake, 64 contradicts its directional signage as East Interstate 64 and turns southwest, where it meets Interstate 464. 64 then has exits with US 17 and US 460 again. Finally, 64 meets its end with 2 of its own spur routes, 264 and 664, ending in Chesapeake, Virginia. Wow, that was a long one. Not quite as long as Interstate 80, but it still took a while. I'm planning on doing Interstate 43 after this, so you can look forward to a return to the Midwest next time.
Welcome back to WC Geography. I present to you today the 6th episode of Interstates, I-43. After covering 80 and 64, it'll be a nice break to cover one of the shorter interstates, and it'll be a nice return to the Midwest, which is where both owners of this channel are from in case you haven't noticed by now. Interstate 43 runs roughly 192 miles entirely in Wisconsin between Beloit and Green Bay. The route's construction was finished in 1981. Unlike the past 3 or so interstates, 43 actually has quite a bit of interesting history behind it. The first proposal was submitted for an interstate connecting Milwaukee and Green Bay in 1953, but the government strangely denied this request, so Wisconsin took a crack at it again 10 years later and actually proposed a route that would connect Milwaukee, Green Bay, and Superior together. A link to what I think that route would look like is in the description. If my depiction is correct, this would actually make a lot of sense. Interstates are supposed to end at other interstates, even if some don't follow this logic. So this would mean that Interstate 39 would end at 43 in Wausau, and 35 and 43 would meet each other in Duluth. However, the government being the government decided that only the section between Milwaukee and Green Bay was needed, so they approved only that much. It seemed odd because this is exactly what Wisconsin proposed back in 1953. Even more interesting is that Interstate 43 was supposed to use the numbering of Interstate 57, which would make sense, but this was rejected due to Illinois not wanting to take 57 through Chicago. Once Interstate 43 was, temporarily, completed, locals decided that they wanted an interstate to connect Beloit to Milwaukee. The government denied this. Then they decided that maybe they want an interstate connecting Janesville to Milwaukee, and a separate interstate to connect Beloit to Milwaukee. They denied the Janesville request, but approved the Beloit one, and yeah, that made a ton of sense. Anyway, they constructed the part from Beloit to Milwaukee, and that's where the route remains today. The route seems to be mostly complete, as the only thing I could find on Wikipedia page about its future is that it might be expanded to 6 lanes in some parts. So with that massive history section out of the way, let's talk about the route itself. Interstate 43 begins at an interchange with I-39, I-90, and Wisconsin Route 81. From here, 43 continues east towards Clinton, where it has an exit with Wisconsin Route 140. From here, 43 enters Delavan. Outside of Delavan, 43 has an exit with US Route 12. It also has exits with Wisconsin State Route 50. 2 miles later in Elkhorn, 43 exits with US Route 12 and Wisconsin Route 11. 43 then exits with State Routes 20, 83, and 164 outside of Milwaukee. I-43 meets US Route 45 and Wisconsin Route 100 right before turning due east and becoming concurrent with Interstate 41. A mile or so later, 43 turns due north where it loses concurrency with 41 but gains concurrency with I-94. In downtown Milwaukee, 43 exits with I-794, where 94 goes west towards Madison and 43 continues north to Sheboygan. On the north side of Milwaukee, 43 exits with Wisconsin routes 145, 190, 57, and 32. 43 then exits with 32 again, as well as Wisconsin Route 60 in Grafton. 43 also meets Wisconsin Route 57 and 33 in Port Washington. It then meets 32 again in Cedar Grove. It then meets Wisconsin State Routes 28, 23, and 42 in Sheboygan. In Manitowoc, 43 meets State Route 42 and services the northeastern end of US Route 151. It also meets US Route 10 and Wisconsin State Route 310. In Denmark, 43 meets Wisconsin Route 96. It then meets US 141 southeast of Green Bay before having a three-way interchange in Bellevue with Wisconsin Route 172. 43 then has a cloverleaf interchange with Wisconsin 57 before cutting through downtown Green Bay. Here it crosses the Fox River, which connects Green Bay to Lake Winnebago. From here, 43 ends at an exit with I-41, US 41, and US 141. That's really all there is to I-43. It's pretty short in comparison to other interstates, but it earns the accomplishment of being the first interstate we've covered so far that doesn't go through Illinois. Speaking of which, I have a sneaking suspicion that 43 may have been planned to go to Freeport and possibly the Quad Cities at some point, but I can't find any proof of this, so it's just a theory. Adieu! Sorry this episode took a while. My animation tablet broke during production, and my phone can't process an episode of this length, so it was made on my computer, meaning there's going to be less animation than usual. But anyways, Interstate 74 is an incomplete interstate spanning the states of Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and North Carolina. As of right now, it runs 492 miles and is planned to go through the states of West Virginia and Virginia in the future. I-74 begins at Interstate 80 in Davenport, Iowa. It goes due south where it meets US Route 67 in Bettendorf before crossing the Mississippi River into Illinois. In Illinois, 74 meets State Routes 92 and 5 right as it crosses the Rock River. Wow, 2 federal waterways in under 5 miles, that's gotta be a record, right? Anyways, 74 turns east as it becomes concurrent with Interstate 280. A few miles later, Interstate 74 meets 80, where 280 ends, 80 continues east, and 74 turns south as it becomes the Chicago-Kansas City Expressway. 74 then has exits with State Route 81 in Andover and State Route 17 in Woodhull. In Galesburg, 74 has a cloverleaf interchange with US Route 34, where it leaves the Chicago-Kansas City Expressway. It has a few more exits before meeting US 150, its twin route. Every interstate has what I like to call a twin route. A twin route is the US highway that used to exist before the interstate came to take its place. 74 then has exits in Brimfield and Kickapoo. It then meets Illinois Route 6 and I-474 in Peoria. In downtown Peoria, 74 catches the routes of Illinois State Route 29, Illinois State Route 40, US Route 24, US Route 150, and Illinois State Route 8. 74 meets I-474 again and I-155 in Morton, where 74 leaves the Peoria area. 74 then has exits in Goodfield, Carlock, and Newton. In Normal, 74 turns south and becomes concurrent with Interstate 55, nearly missing I-39. It exits US 150 and Illinois State Route 9, where 55 leaves the concurrency and 74 turns east. It then exits with US 51, where it leaves Bloomington Normal. 74 exits with US 136 in Empire and Illinois Route 54 in Farmer City. It then meets Illinois 47 in Mahomet and has a cloverleaf interchange with Interstate 57 as it enters Champaign. In Champaign-Urbana, I-74 also meets Illinois Route 130 and US Route 45. Interstate 74 meets the small towns of St. Joseph, Ogden, Fithian, and Oakwood. In Batestown, 74 meets US 150 again and crosses the Vermilion River shortly after. In Danville, 74 has a cloverleaf exit with US 150, the last 150 exit, and then crosses the Vermilion River again. 74 has a few more exits before entering its third state, Indiana. Interstate 74 first meets Indiana State Road 63. Shortly thereafter, it crosses the Wabash River. A couple miles down the road, it meets US 41 in Petersburg. It also meets Route 25 in Waynetown. On the outskirts of Crawfordsville, 74 meets US 231, Indiana 47, and Indiana 32. Further down the road, 74 meets State Road 75 in Jamestown. Finally, 74 meets Indiana 39 in Lisbon. The next few miles of 74 are confusing due to the sheer amount of concurrencies, spurs, bypasses, and exits it takes as we pass around Indianapolis. First, 74 meets Indiana Route 267 in Brownsburg. From here, 74 turns south as it begins its concurrency with I-465. Immediately afterwards, the two act as the eastern end of US 136. Less than 2 miles later, US 36 joins the concurrency. Another mile later, US 40 joins the concurrency as well. So let's review. We have I-74, I-465, US 36, and US 40 all on the same road, and we aren't even 1/4 of the way around Indianapolis yet. A few miles later, the four meet Interstate 70, and from here turn due east to cross the south side of the city. We have an exit with Indiana Road 67, and then have US 31 and Road 37 join the concurrency. That's 6 routes on one road. I would say this is a lot, but we haven't covered any interstates on the East Coast yet, so... Anyway, the 6 meet Interstate 65, and a few miles later, 74 leaves this mess of a concurrency, picking up US 421 to join it as well. The two leave Indianapolis and meet roads 9 and 44 in Shelbyville. From here, US 421 leaves the concurrency in Greensburg, where 74 meets Indiana Road 3. In Batesville, 74 meets State Road 229 and then meets State Road 1 in St. Leon. 74 crosses the Whitewater River and becomes concurrent with US 52, where the two continue into their next state, Ohio. I-74 and US 52 enter the town of Harrison, Ohio. From here, they become concurrent with I-275 and cross the Great Miami River in Miamitown. I-74 leaves the concurrency and exits in a few Cincinnati suburbs before ending at Interstate 75. Thanks for watching, and be sure to wait, that's not all. Since North Carolina seems desperate for interstates, 74 meets a new beginning at the Virginia-North Carolina state line. 74 begins on a concurrency with Interstate 77, though 74 breaks it off before the two can actually have an exit together. In White Plains, 74 exits with US 601 and then ends again at an exit with US 52. You're going to see this a lot. Interstate 74 in North Carolina isn't complete yet, which is great news for me. It means I get to do this episode again later, so there's lots of random ends and begins. For example, 74 randomly begins again at an exit with Interstate 40 in Winston-Salem. From here, it meets State Route 68 and Business Interstate 85 in High Point. It then meets the real Interstate 85. Down the road, it starts a concurrency with Interstate 73, the other in-progress interstate in North Carolina. From here, 74 meets State Route 49 and US Route 64 in Ashboro. It also meets State Route 27 in Biscoe. In Ellerbe, 73 and 74 lose their status as interstate to US 220. 74 begins for its fourth and final time in Alma. It is concurrent with US 74 all the way through Lumberton, where it meets Interstate 95. Finally, 74 ends at an exit with North Carolina Route 41 in Lumberton. Future plans for 74 indicate a concurrency and eventual complete takeover of US 74 throughout southeastern North Carolina. From what I can tell, this means 74, both interstate and US route, will end in Wilmington at Interstate 40. Thanks for watching, and be sure to be notified when I release the next episode of Interstates, which will be the end of Season 1. Today on episode 8 of Interstates, we'll be covering 8 interstates. Not Interstate 8, but 8 different interstates. Today I'll be talking about Interstate H1, H2, H3, H201, A1, A2, A3, and A4, also known as the Hawaiian and Alaskan interstates. Starting in Alaska, we've got Interstate A3. If you're wondering why I'm doing A3 first, that's because I'm an idiot who doesn't understand the Alaskan interstate system, and I got the script wrong on the first few drafts. Now, the difficult thing about Alaskan interstates is that they're all unsigned. Even on Google Maps, they're unsigned. So finding their routes is extremely difficult, not to mention they don't follow interstate standards. They're all just state routes that are called interstates. According to Wikipedia, A3 begins in Soldotna and continues to wind its way around southern Alaska, not really hitting any cities. It goes around the Turnagain arm of the Cook Inlet. From there, it continues to Anchorage, where it is actually at interstate standards in some spots. And that's it, that's the end of A3. Now on to A4. A4 begins at an interchange with A1 in Palmer, and from here it travels through multiple small towns. Eventually it works its way up to Fairbanks, and in Fairbanks it meets A2 where it ends. It's a long interstate, but there really isn't much to talk about. A2's turn. A2 begins at the Canadian border and continues to Talk, where it meets Alaska State Route 5 and Interstate A1. It then meets Alaska State Route 4 in Delta Junction. And now finally on to A1. A1 begins around Anchorage and outside of Palmer. A1 exits its own road, this is where it meets Interstate A4, and turns northeast towards Palmer. From here, A1 follows the Matanuska River. A1 meets Alaska Route 4 in Glen Allen, and then A2 in Talk, which is where A1 ends. Even after going through them all, I still don't completely understand how Alaska does its interstates, but that doesn't matter, because now we're moving on to Hawaii. Interstate H1 starts at State Route 93 and has exits in Kapolei and Village Park before meeting H2. It has an exit in Pearl City and then meets H201 and H3 in a massive jumble of an interchange in Halawa. It passes Pearl Harbor and the airport and then meets up with 201 again. From here it has several smaller exits in Honolulu before ending and becoming State Route 72. Interstate H201 is just a short bypass of H1. H2 begins at H1 in Pearl City and goes due north. It has exits in Waipio and Mililani before ending at an exit with state routes 99 and 80 in Wahaiwa. That's it. It just runs 8 miles. Interstate H3 is not as short, but is still contained to the island of Oahu, just like its brothers. It begins at an exit with H1 and H201 Halawa. It continues northeast from here, crossing through a small mountain range before meeting State Route 63 on the other end. It also meets routes 83 and 630 before ending just north of Marine Corps Base in Hawaii. That's all for this episode and the first season of Interstates. As much as I procrastinated this season, I had a lot of fun making these, and I hope to see you guys this summer when we make season 2. Until then, as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.